The defending Super Bowl champs walked into 2025 with the goal of being the 10th team to become back-to-back champions. And really, the Philadelphia Eagles were perfectly positioned to do so. Not a ton changed about the personnel on this team. The offense still had plenty of firepower, and the defense was looking as elite as ever. The main loss was the offensive coordinator Kellen Moore taking a head coaching job down in New Orleans. Obviously not ideal, but the coordinators leave all the time for head coaching gigs, and teams survived the following year. But the Eagles found a way to disappoint their rabid fan base once again by going 11-6 and winning the division. That makes sense. That's what you get when you have high expectations and fail to meet them, apparently. The same could be said for their fantasy football season. Lots of highly drafted players that just fell flat. Let's break it down, starting with the conductor of the tush-push train. Jalen Hurts was drafted as the QB3 but finished the season as the QB9, making managers feel like they left the lot with a lemon. Hurts was still a threat to score a rushing touchdown anytime the offense got close enough in the red zone, and still had 7 games over 20 points, with 3 more at 19. So why did we feel like it was worse than it was? Probably because the back half of the season was much quieter than the front half. After the bye week, Hurts scored under 15 points in half of his games. The last thing we need is a coin flip quarterback when we are trying to make the fantasy playoffs. Hurts is a player you can still trust going forward. Just a bummer we saw some bugs in one of the better Konami code quarterbacks out there. In 2024, we saw what an excellent season from Saquon Barkley looked like. But in 2025, we saw the average case for the 2024 Offensive Player of the Year. Barkley's 1,140 yards and 7 touchdowns would be great for any other player. But as is the theme of the team, the expectations were sky high, and Saquon was another player who didn't live up to the hype. If we remove the preseason bias and look at what Barkley actually did accomplish, we'd see that he was still a top 15 running back, and he was still helping your team more often than not. And best of all, he's a player we can probably get a little later in drafts this year. It only makes sense that the wide receivers had an equally weird year alongside the quarterback. AJ Brown and DeVonta Smith are usually locked in as top 24 wide receivers every year, and surprisingly, that was the case again this year. However, ask any AJ Brown manager and you'll probably hear how disappointing he was in the first half of the year. The back half was a completely different story, and it's important to keep that as a reminder that AJ Brown is the type of elite receiver who can still put up 1,003 yards and 7 touchdowns in a, quote, down year. DeVonta Smith also topped the 1,000-yard mark on 77 receptions this past year. His meager 4 touchdowns were felt as he barely squeaked into the top 24, finishing as wide receiver 21. He was still rated as the 26th best wide receiver per PFF. He just left you wanting so much more from a wide receiver too. Here's to hoping that a new offensive coordinator can help open this pair up in offense and bring back that matchup-winning fantasy production we were so used to seeing. Dallas Goedert was the third option in this passing attack that you never really felt comfortable starting, even though you probably had to. He opened the season on a heater, finishing as the top tight end in fantasy twice through the first 6 weeks of the season. In that span, we saw 33 targets, which turned into 24 receptions and 243 yards with 5 touchdowns. We love that in a tight end who we drafted later in the draft. A rough patch after the bye week probably meant Goedert hit the waivers at one point in your league. In fact, I even told you to drop him in our waiver show. But his bounce back performance charging into the playoffs proves he's a viable fantasy asset as long as he's healthy. It'd be a disservice to the Eagles to not mention their elite defense and their ability to change the game each and every week. Finishing at 7th in fantasy points scored, the Eagles were a set it and forget it type of defense and special teams. It's a young group that's ready to put a hurting on opposing offenses once again next year. There isn't a ton that the Eagles team needs heading into the 2026 season. They've addressed the need for better offensive play calling by moving on from Kevin Patullo and hiring Sean Mannion, the former quarterback coach for the Green Bay Packers. They would be smart to grab some offensive line depth as injuries to their offensive line, notably Lane Johnson, hurt an otherwise efficient run game. If they do lose AJ Brown in the offseason, they'll need to add another big-time wide receiver name to keep this passing attack potent. What do you think the Philadelphia Eagles need in 2026 to get back to the Super Bowl? Let me know in the comments.